We are here to demonstrate our solidarity with the Palestinian people against the ethnic cleansing that is ongoing right now. That is not surprising. No one should be surprised at what is happening. But we're also here to discuss what we can do about it, because a lot of people, millions of people around the world, are disgusted by what's happening and want to fight against this. So, if you weren't living under a rock, yesterday the Israeli Air Force bombed a hospital, killing at least 500 people, although it's hard to tell when this sort of thing happened because there are going to be hundreds. Under the rubble, the health ministry in Gaza said at least 3,300 people have been killed. That's the number I have so far, and 11,000 wounded, and probably another 1,200 under rubble, although again, these numbers are kind of neither here nor there, probably, because if you've probably seen the pictures, how do you really know? And they're preparing a ground invasion. And who's talking about this? Where's the universal condemnation of the Israeli state? Where is the cutting off of military funding? Where is the cutting off of humanitarian aid, like the EU did after the attack that Hamas launched on the 7th? Doesn't exist. I've never heard of it. Have you? Doesn't happen. We need to ask why. So far, all we've got is our great Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, saying yesterday, it's not acceptable to hit a hospital. Thank you, Captain Obvious. So one of the things I think we need to highlight here and understand is the blatant hypocrisy. I think this issue, above all else, reeks of hypocrisy, imperialist hypocrisy. Ukraine. What was the argument that we have been bombarded with, especially at the beginning of the war? Russia has invaded and occupied Ukraine, is annexing parts of Ukraine, violating Ukrainian sovereignty. Therefore, we must arm Ukraine to the teeth to resist this, because they have the right to resistance, they have self-determination, right? In the words, or in the mouths of some of the biggest imperialists who have violated self-determination and sovereignty of people all over the globe. With Palestine, don't they fit this bill? Yes, but nope, they're arming the oppressor, the occupier, the annexer. Why the double standard? I'll have to ask the question, if Putin gave the Ukrainians 24-hour notice, would it be okay? Because that's what Israel's doing in Gaza. We're giving you 24-hour notice, giving 1 million people 24 hours notice to move, which is an impossible order to actually comply with. The reason why there is the blatant hypocrisy here is that US imperialism, Canadian imperialism, and NATO don't actually care about Ukrainians, don't actually care about Palestinians, definitely don't, or Jewish Israelis for that matter. They don't actually care about that. What they actually are doing is they're looking out for their economic and geopolitical interests, their imperialist interests all over the globe, and they will use whatever people they can to get that. And they'll manipulate sentiments, and they'll claim to stand for self-determination and sovereignty, blah, 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 when they don't. So that's why they've taken these contradictory stances in these instances. As Lenin actually explained with World War I, which was a war, if you know much about World War I, based around the self-determination of peoples, and everyone was trying to pick a side and manipulating the different nationalities. Lenin said the small peoples are like small change for imperialism. They toss them aside. Remember the Kurds? What happened with the Kurds in Syria? Abandoned, right? And this is the fact of the matter on the world level, and especially with what we're seeing in Palestine. Following the attack, the surprise attack by Hamas on October 7th, what I believe has happened, we've been victim to a mass media campaign of sheer hypocrisy, as I hope I've already started to highlight. Now, there was a wave of moral indignation from all the mainstream press, the capitalist politicians in the West, a unanimous campaign in the media by all the major political parties, left or right, actually. Anyone who tried to take a position in defense of the Palestinians, against the oppression of the Palestinians, anyone who tried to explain the context of these events who try to explain why something like this would happen, how this was actually inevitable in this. Something like this was an inevitable outcome of the situation, was denounced as a Hamas sympathizer, a terrorist sympathizer. We've all maybe some of us here have been victim of this online. Now, obviously, killing of civilians is naturally repugnant to anybody, to all of us, right? Thou shalt not kill, of course. And I believe that the capitalists, the imperialists, they use this sentiment that we all have against us, actually, to manipulate us. In reality, it's not a thou shalt not kill. It's you can't kill, but I can. And whoever we say can kill, they're allowed to kill, but certain others can't. So it's total imperialist hypocrisy. After these powers have launched wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, hundreds of thousands killed, destabilizing the whole region, millions of displaced people, the war in Yemen, carried out by a U.S. ally, Saudi Arabia, the bombing of Libya, destabilized the whole region, right? Leading to a huge refugee crisis. Where was the denunciation of this? Where was any of this? This is perpetrated by U.S. imperialism, their allies. So they're not the ones to talk about terrorism and killing and about how bad it is, right? So it's the hypocrisy that we need to highlight here. Another one, anti-Semitism. Quite commonly, especially in the last week, anyone defending the Palestinians has been accused of anti-Semitism. I've even read online tweets that people said, if you try to add context, that's anti-Semitic. I wasn't aware that we've gotten to the point that material reality is anti-Semitic. This is nonsense. Fred Hahn, the president of CUPE Ontario, big public sector union, stated, he stated, quote, I know that I'm thankful for the power of workers, the power of resistance around the globe. He was denounced by the National Post in an editorial for supporting Hamas, therefore. The federal minister of labor came out accusing Hahn of spreading anti-Semitism and asking him to be dismissed from his post in the union. Wait a minute. Don't you remember, isn't it a couple weeks ago, the friggin' parliament unanimously celebrated a Nazi? Who are these people to talk about anti-Semitism? The blatant hypocrisy. They celebrated a Nazi because they said we were confused. They said he was fighting against Russia in World War II. Now, I don't claim to be an expert on military history and World War II, but as far as I'm aware, if you were fighting against Russia, you were on the side of the Nazis. That's what was happening. So either we have an extremely ignorant parliament, which is probably true, or they're just extremely cynical and hypocritical, which is also probably true. So yeah, these people are not the people to lecture anyone about anti-Semitism. And all this whole media campaign, it was whipped up around Israel has the right to defend itself. Biden said it, Trudeau said it, Emmanuel Macron said it, Sunak said it, all the major leaders of all the imperialist countries. Israel has the right to defend itself. Centered around what? This was all just filled in the so-called free press, this argument that Israel has the right to defend itself. But what does that mean? Did anyone ask what that meant? What was about to happen? Well, we're seeing it right now. You have Biden, the president of the wealthiest imperialist state in the world, expedited military equipment, ammunition to Israel. Canadian imperialism has done similar. Western countries across the globe have done it. Aiding and abetting ethnic cleansing in Palestine. They have blood on their hands. Canadian imperialism, US imperialism, blood on their hands. Complete and utter hypocrisy. Do not the Palestinians have the right to defend themselves? Nobody said anything about that. Nobody's saying anything about that either. They have the right to die. Actually, in the words of an Israeli minister, they have the right to be subdued, the right to move, or to die. That's what he said their options are. Another amazing position that some people are taking is there's two sides, as if it's an equal conflict, right? Which I think is blatantly ridiculous. There is one side of one of the most imperialist nations, one of the most powerful imperialist nations on the face of the planet, armed to the teeth, in alliance with the most powerful imperialist nations of Western Europe, Canada, and America, and one of the most oppressed people on the globe, don't even have a military. Running water and electricity are under the control of Israel. Very little support from anyone. abandoned also by other reactionary Arab regimes, governments in the region. Gaza has been compared to an open-air prison, regularly punished, slaughtered. The West Bank is actually increasingly, it's not even an entity. It's a Swiss cheese. It's been divided up into small little things. You can't pass from one area to the other without going through a checkpoint. Settlements, which are now at over 500,000, which have been emboldened by the far-right government in Israel and far-right ultra-nationalist Jewish settlers, which most of them, I think, are a big portion are actually from America. They essentially have armed fascist militias that this year have killed over 200 people in the West Bank, aided and abetted by police, by military. Thomas Mulcair, ex-NDP leader, so that it's not just conservatives and liberals, he came out saying, there are no two sides. I do agree with that. Do you think he means that what I've just described, that Israel is super powerful and exploiting and oppressing the Palestinians? That's not what he meant. Reality has been inversed. Israel is the oppressed, and Palestine is the oppressor. It is so ridiculous to state, but we've been led to believe that through our media and through the government. And also another thing, politicians act as though they're shocked at what Israel's doing. Why are you shocked? They said this was what they were going to do, especially this year. In previous years, sometimes they'd use some new nice language. We're democratic and we're defending ourselves and all this sort of stuff. There's ministers in the current government. Netanyahu's found himself in troubled waters recently, and he's been allying with far-right Jewish supremacist groups, one of which calls himself a fascist openly. And they've been openly calling for a new Nakba. If you don't know what that means, that's what happened in 1947, where over 700,000 Palestinians were displaced. That was the birth of Israel, actually. This is true. They've been calling for a new Nakba. To be clear, they're not just calling for one. They're carrying it out right now. That is what they are doing. What is asking 1 million people to move in 24 hours, if not a mass displacement, like 1947? Now, some Western politicians, as I said, they're saying they're not happy that Israel's doing this. But who are they? What hypocrisy? They literally said this is what they were going to do. You're giving them arms, knowing well what they were going to do. Ben-Gvir, who's a security minister in the Israeli government, earlier this year called for the wiping out of Hawara, a Palestinian town. He said he wanted to completely wipe the town out. Netanyahu, at the UN General Assembly this past September, I don't know if you saw this, he showed up with a map of the Middle East for the plan for the Middle East. Funny thing about the map, had Israel, which included the Golan Heights, and there was no Palestine. There was no Gaza, there was no West Bank. I think anyone with half a brain can see what's going on. And people in Gaza and West Bank are paying attention. They're noticing this, right? No Palestine, wiped off the map, ethnic cleansing, new Nakba. You'd have to be deaf and blind not to notice what's happening. So, yeah, we are communists. We are Marxists. We are revolutionary communists. What does that have to do with anything? What is the Marxist approach to this? Now, in every imperialist war, and this is an imperialist war, it's not just military. It's ideological. It's political. They have to justify it because it's a small group of people that want to carry out the war in their interests, and the only way they can do it is by convincing millions of others that it is justified, by demonizing the people they want to kill, by treating them as subhuman, by convincing us that they're worthy of being killed. And this is precisely what's been happening in the press. So the belligerent parties, in this instance, US imperialism, Canadian imperialism, especially Israeli imperialism, they make use of atrocities, real or invented, sometimes completely invented, to justify their acts of violence and murder. So the communist attitude is not based on sensationalist media stories or emotional responses or on who threw the first punch, which is a ridiculous way of looking at a long-standing conflict like this. So how do we approach it? In every struggle, regardless of the particulars actually, We always take the side of the oppressed. We are duty-bound to take the side of the oppressed, never of the rich and the powerful. And in this conflict, more than almost any other I can remember, it's super clear. If you know anything, if you haven't been living under a rock, this is so clear. Who are the oppressors? Do I even have to go through it? I will a little bit. Is it the Palestinians who are occupying land that does not belong to them and are holding it by force? Is it the Palestinians who are driving Israelis out of their land? Is it the Palestinians who are denying Israelis basic elementary rights? Do I need to go over this? This is a bit silly that you have to have this type of argument, but you do, because in the mainstream, this is questioned, even though it is patently true. But when confronted with a situation, what is to be done? Of course, the only option for an oppressed people like the Palestinian is to rise up in revolt against this barbaric oppression. It is inevitable. A people cannot be held down like this. And it is a regrettable fact that every revolt of the oppressed always has been accompanied by quite a lot of violence, actually, which is what we saw on October 7th. But the question is, and many people were very upset when that attack happened. It was shocking, shocked the world, especially in the West, right? The question is, who is to blame for that? That is one we should get into. Now, if you answer Hamas, I think you actually don't understand anything and you haven't learned anything. This is ultimately a philosophical question. Why do people do things? Why are people driven to such extreme measures? It's presented in the media and by right-wing politicians that it's as if people have been seized by evil spirits randomly. People are taken out of context, right? And just treated, they even said in the media, it's a struggle of good versus evil. It's like a fairy tale. I don't think that the Israeli imperialism or US imperialism, I don't think anybody, to be honest, that has been paying attention has the right to be surprised by that Hamas attack. You do not have the right to be shocked. This was to be expected. Context, if I may add. I already talked a little bit about this. Netanyahu, already a super conservative, he's kind of like a Trump figure in Israel. As I said, he's been basing himself on an alliance with the far-right Jewish supremacists. He has emboldened this ultra-right-wing settler movement, and they've been attacking Palestinians. Hundreds have been killed just this year in the West Bank. 2 days before the Hamas attack, I actually did not see any mainstream news story that mentioned this. 2 days before the attack, a Jewish supremacist mob raided Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third most holy site in Islam. They raided it with protection from the police, aided and embedded by the government. People in West Bank and Gaza could see the writing on the wall. They're being replaced. The program of the Jewish supremacists in Israel is to bulldoze that mosque and build a synagogue. That's what they want to do. They might get away with it, actually. So people have a natural reaction to this. They are opposed. They are helpless. They do not know what else to do. They had a big mass peaceful movement in 2018. I don't know if you remember that. Peaceful movement. What happened? The Israeli military opened fire, killing hundreds. So I think a lot of people drew the conclusion, you try peaceful movement, they call us terrorists, they gun us down. So what's the difference? They're going to call us terrorists and gun us down either way. And many people draw that conclusion. But yeah, who's to blame for that? Well, I think you probably understand my logic. Israeli imperialism is to blame for this. The settlements, the campaign of ethnic cleansing that's gone on for decades, that is to blame. Until you stop that, you're not gonna get rid of Hamas. You're not gonna stop terrorism. You're not gonna stop anything like that. Actually, the Israeli military strategists, I think, have accepted this. They have a strategy that's known as mowing the lawn, which means, the grass grows a bit, you got to mow it down. That's what they're doing right now. They're mowing the lawn, which is an acceptance of a perpetual state of war and exacting a disproportionate amount of violence on the Palestinians for every Israeli death, for every action. And if you look, there's been a lot of stuff shared on social media. You probably may have seen it. graphs that show the amount of dead in every single conflict over the years. It is massively Palestinians that are slaughtered in every single conflict. And actually, they plan to do this every few years, mowing the lawn. I don't know if you know about mowing lawns. What happens? What does mowing a lawn do? Actually causes the grass to grow more, faster. So you're not, if you want to, and many people argue, but what do you expect? They have to fight Hamas. They have to fight Hamas. This is not going to do away with Hamas. It's actually going to create more Hamas, because more oppression is going to create more reaction of this nature. You don't have to be a genius to see that. So anyone who's upset at the Hamas attack, which was tragic in some ways, should be upset at Netanyahu, should be upset at Israeli imperialism, should be upset at our own government for aiding and abetting this horrible situation. Talked about Hamas a bit. Obviously did not start with this question, because that's what almost anybody who wanted to talk about it a week ago would have started with. Do we support Hamas? Of course not. We are revolutionary communists. We have never supported a group like Hamas, nor do we share their ideology or the methods of struggle that they use. We have our own program, own method, own ideas. We base ourselves on the ideas of class struggle between the oppressor, the oppressed, between rich and poor, between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. But yeah, we gotta understand the hypocrisy that is occurring right now, which I hope I have highlighted. So yeah, we are communists. What is the communist? What do we do? What is the communist solution? Well, we demand an end to the invasion, an end to the bombing of Gaza, an end to the occupation, an end and reverse to all the Zionist settlement and land grabs, an end to the military support for Israeli imperialism. We demand an end to oppression, for equal rights for all people, regardless of ethnicity or religion. Now, how is that possible? Especially for us in Canada, it can seem hopeless. Like, what do you even do? We're sitting here in Canada. We're not in the Middle East. We can't really do anything. It can feel hopeless. So I believe this struggle, if you pay attention to news in the Middle East, is exploding in country after country. There's mass demonstrations in most Arab countries. And so I think correctly so, people in the Middle East see this struggle as their struggle. They see it as a struggle against imperialism, right? And rightly so. And I think what we need to do is we need to see this as our struggle as well. It is our struggle. Canadian imperialism is an enemy of the Palestinian people. They are aiding Israeli imperialism to carry out ethnic cleansing and the genocide of Palestinians. But Canadian imperialism is a product of Canadian capitalism, which is also an enemy of Canadian workers, which is increasingly making life unbearable. The rents, wage stagnation, wage erosion. We're all having trouble surviving, right? So I think we should all see this as a struggle against the capitalist system and against imperialism as a whole. And we need to bring that message to Canadian workers here. Like Marx, if you pick up any Marx book, he famously said, workers of all countries unite, workers of the world unite. It's our duty as working class people, as revolutionary communists, to be in solidarity with the Palestinian people and take this to our communities here, into the broader layers of the working class, into the labor movement, our communities, our schools, etc. Now, we have comrades active in the trade union movement who have already passed resolutions in their trade unions in solidarity with Palestinian people against the occupation, against the bombings, etc. That's a good start. I encourage anyone here, if you're involved in the labor movement, so far the trade unions have been quite silent. I think a lot of the trade union leadership was shocked and stunned and bent to this mass media campaign after the attack on October 7th and have been basically paralyzed on this issue, in spite of the fact that many trade unions for decades have actually passed resolutions and put funding into solidarity actions with the Palestinian people. When the moment of truth is arised, you found a bit of paralysis. So I think from the ranks, we can carry that into the trade unions, into the working class in Canada for solidarity with the Palestinian people. On campuses and schools. Now, the Palestinian Youth Movement, it's an international organization. They just today, I think it was today or yesterday, made a call for a week of action on campuses across the world, if not. I think it's in Canada, the United States, but maybe even across the world. And we are in full 100% support of this call. And we will be organizing events like this, rallies, uniting with anybody on the campuses who are in solidarity with the Palestinian people to do so. We actually are organizing a rally at TMU. We have some TMU students here. Maybe some of them can talk about that, uniting with Palestinian groups and others on campus. The rally will be, I believe, at 3 o'clock on this Friday. Also, I believe there's a rally at U of T I've heard about, same time on Friday, so people should show up to that. There's a rally on Monday I just heard about. So yeah, we are involved in this movement trying to, I think, take initiatives because, to be honest, it's a bit dead on most campuses. So yeah, this is the concrete stuff that we can do. And I hope that everyone here, if you want to do something, help us get involved. Help us to bring this to our schools, our neighborhoods, to build the Palestinian solidarity movement and to really cut through the lies and hypocrisy, I think especially. And fight imperialism at home, right? We can fight imperialism at home, which will weaken, any success that we have weakens Israeli imperialism, which strengthens the cause of the Palestinians. We are, as Anna mentioned, we are internationalists. That is what internationalism means. So, Intifada. I was at the rally last night. Very good slogans in favor of Intifada. One solution, Intifada, revolution. What does that mean? That is what it means. It means a revolution in Arabic. It means uprising. And I believe this actually needs to be, we are communists. We are in favor of revolution, right? We are revolutionaries. This is what we must have as a general strategy. We don't believe in liberalism. We don't have faith in the United Nations. We don't have faith in our own government, which is a capitalist government, as I hope I've outlined. We believe in a revolution of the oppressed masses. You might think, this guy is a utopian. That's impossible. Well, as I mentioned, there's mass demonstrations in most major cities all across the Middle East. There's mass demonstrations in the West. There was 150,000 people demonstrating in London a few days ago. There was thousands of people last night. There's thousands of people in different Canadian cities. Now, that's not a revolution yet, of course. Many here might remember the Arab Spring that began in 2011. This was a huge revolutionary movement that toppled governments all throughout the Middle East. A revolution is possible. We live in a revolutionary epoch. And really that is ultimately the solution to this, is a revolution in the Middle East and ultimately around the world. And we are fighting for Intifada here in Canada. We are fighting for revolution here in Canada against imperialism and against capitalism. Last night there was a lot of great slogans, but then there was a suggestion at the end. Someone had said that we should write to our MPs. Now, I understand the sentiment because people are like, what do we do? What do we do? Write to your MP. To be honest, we wouldn't recommend that. It's a waste of time, that's why. Or call your MP. An angry phone call or a letter is not going to change these people's mind. You want to change their mind? Build a mass movement. Build a strike movement. You have workers, unions at Canada Post, dockers unions, who have actually signed on to resolutions and campaigns in solidarity with the Palestinian people. They can refuse to ship goods to the Israeli government, to the Israeli military. You have workers that work in military equipment factories in Ontario. Those workers, if they understand, can refuse to ship arms, right? Or can refuse to build the arms, can actually stop if they understand where these arms are going, right? The working class has power. And I believe that the working class is actually starting to understand, starting to gain consciousness of the general crisis of the capitalist system. And the general crisis is not just economic. I believe it's at every level: diplomatic, military, social, environmental. And this conflict shows an intense imperialist conflict. Intifada, back to Intifada. Well, if you look at the history of the Palestinian struggle, I don't have a lot of time. I've already been speaking for just about half an hour. There's been lots of different methods tried. There was the guerrilla Fayadin in the early stage. There was a lot of appeals to the United Nations with Yasser Arafat. There was terrorist attacks, bombings, things over the years. Different groups trying different things just to stop the situation. Nothing worked. None of it worked, actually. It all kind of ended up leading to a situation in which the Palestinians were more dispossessed, were finding themselves just in a worse and worse off situation. If we look at the history, the one thing that actually forced Israel to start making concessions was the first Intifada. Started in 1987. It was a mass uprising of Palestinians with sticks and stones fighting courageously against the Israeli military and actually handing it to them a lot of the time. And this went on for years. This was a sustained movement for years. And ultimately, this really, I think, is a shining example of the kind of movement. We need a revolutionary movement. We are revolutionaries. And like I said, good news, we live in revolutionary times. Capitalism has failed. It is in crisis around the world. And more people are realizing that, are losing hope in any parliamentary way, in any reformist way, in any tinkering, in any international body, who all seem aligned against us, right? It's not a surprise that it seems like it's aligned against us, because they are. All these institutions are institutions of the capitalist system that are there to protect the capitalist system. So yes, we need a revolution in the Middle East. We need a revolution in Canada, in the United States, to fight against imperialism, which oppresses people all over the world. And ultimately, like I said, we are communists. At the end of the day, we believe that you're not going to have an end to situations like this in Gaza under the capitalist system. Meaning that with capitalism, you have imperialism. You have major powers controlled by small groups of billionaires, capitalists, finance capitalists, banks, mining companies, conglomerates, who plunder the world, who play peoples off against each other and commit atrocities so that they can maintain control. In fact, this situation in the Middle East finds its roots with the carving up of the Middle East after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire following World War I. Imperialism, mostly Britain, France, the US, basically divided the Middle East up into small states, took basically a map and just drew lines and cut peoples in half, and then pitted people against each other. This is what is known as divide and rule. The British have a long history of very successfully doing this. They've done it in Ireland, they did it in India, and they've done it quite fabulously in the Middle East, and with bloody consequences. And this has created a poisonous situation, which has been, people talk about the Middle East and they go, ugh, Middle East, always like that, right? There's always something happening. Because it created this poisonous situation, which is a breeding ground for endless wars, national and religious conflict, hatred, and imperialism intervenes, propping up the most reactionary regimes and pitting people against each other, so that there's no strong state that can really stand up against them, right? So we believe that working class people of all nations have no interest in any of this. We don't have any interest in oppressing the workers of another nation. We have no interest in conquering territory or subduing other people. In fact, Engels, I even say this about Jewish Israeli workers, they ultimately don't have an interest in oppressing the Palestinians. Actually, Friedrich Engels, Marx's partner in crime, he said famously, you cannot be free if you oppress another people. And I think that couldn't be more clear in Israel. Jews were promised a safe haven by the Zionists, and now they have a perpetual state of war. Actually, Leon Trotsky, the great Russian revolutionary, he said that this is before Israel was founded, but he knew what was going on in the Zionist movement. And he said, look, the foundation of a Jewish state in Palestine is a bloody trap for the Jewish people. And that's precisely what it is. And we can see that. So we believe that, look, even if you just take the Middle East is a rich place, actually. It's very rich in resources, productivity, very educated in many countries, population. But you have capitalism, right? You have capitalism in the Middle East. Taken out of the hands, the wealth, taken out of the hands of the Zionist ruling class, out of the hands of the reactionary Arab dictatorships, out of the hands of the imperialists, we could have a rationally planned economy to meet the needs of the people, so people don't have to be fighting against each other, to have democratic workers' control over the immense wealth and production of society. We can actually begin to solve a lot of these problems that seem so unsolvable in the current moment. And that's why everything we fight for, we say must be linked up to fight for a socialist federation of the whole of Palestine as part of a socialist federation of the Middle East. Intifada until victory. Thank you. Well, damn, that was a good discussion. Sometimes you do these events and it's like crickets, you know? So I love this. There was too many people to intervene, too many people that probably didn't get to say what you wanted to say. So, sorry, this is the nature of these events. I hope you stick around after. We usually go for a drink after to talk more informally. I think, and I hope you come out to more events like this if you didn't get a chance to ask your question or intervene or talk more. So yeah, there is way too many questions for me to possibly address. So I'm going to try to tie together a few of the main threads, which I guess a few different people touched on. So I think racism was mentioned, and I think that does cover a bit the settler question. It does cover a bit anti-Semitism that was mentioned. It does cover all types of prejudice and oppression, I believe. And then how that relates, like, are we just this type of vulgar Marxists say, no, forget about that. It's a distraction. Class. No, that would be ridiculous. It's patently false that the only type of oppression is class oppression. That's not true. You have racism, you have anti-Semitism, you have sexism, you have misogyny, you have all these things, right? You have the oppression of trans people that's being whipped up right now by the right wing. The question is how do communists fight against oppression? That's the question. It's not whether or not we downplay it or ignore it. That is not the question. It's how do we fight against it? So quite common you have in an imperialist country, a rich imperialist country, where the capitalists have been able to buy class peace a bit. They fund these universities that teach wild and wonderful ideas. Quite common there's this idea that we all have an interest in oppressing each other, right? Where does oppression come from? Well, it comes from each and every one of us. We're all oppressors, right? We don't really believe that, and we don't actually find that that's actually a useful way to view the question. And it's actually extremely useful for who? The capitalists. Why? They want us doing that. They want us fighting each other. They want us squabbling over that. Now, does that mean that we abandon the struggle against racism and sexism and whatnot? Not in the slightest. So as I think Fadi and I think some others that talked about a bit, what is the origins of these things? Why is racism and oppression so prevalent? Like I mentioned about the trans question, I believe that this is being intentionally whipped up today by the far right or by even in the mainstream conservative movement to a certain degree to make political to divide the working class, to gain support on a social or cultural issue when normally these workers would not support their program, right? So the right wing will quite often, actually I think even in Israel, like if you talk to most Jewish Israeli workers, they probably do not agree with Netanyahu's economic program. They probably do not. But why would they vote for him or the Likud or some of the right-wing parties? They don't vote on economic issues because they divided them on religion, they divided them on racism, basically. So how do we approach these questions? I believe this applies to so many questions. Actually, this relates to the question of like settlers. You asked this question. We have to ask ourselves, why is Zionism so powerful? Where does Zionism derive its power from? Well, if you know anything about the history of the last couple hundred years, especially the 20th century, Jewish people were probably the most oppressed group in Europe, right? Genocided, whatnot, right? Imperialism and manipulated these sentiments of extremely oppressed groups. Zionism was the political tool to do that, to direct it against other people. And they use, if you've ever argued with the Zionists, you'll notice, what do they always start with? Oh, we're oppressed, we're the victim, we went through the Holocaust, this, that, and the other thing, right? And what it basically is, it's employed to say, it is therefore okay that we did X, Y, Z mean bad thing to others. This is why this approach to fighting oppression is important. We don't take the side of one identity. We're against all forms of oppression. Because nationalism, all forms of nationalism and identity politics, ultimately, at the end of the day, eventually, even from a very oppressed group, remember, the Jews were probably one of the most oppressed groups in the world, can lead you to become the oppressor in different circumstances. So some people have said, oh, I didn't suggest that America should arm the Palestinians. That's not what I was saying earlier. But I'm saying it's hypocritical that they're doing this with Ukraine and then they're doing this with Israel, right? But you could say, oh, but why don't they arm the Palestinians? I think the only way that they possibly would is if there was a big change in the situation, and maybe they would in certain circumstances, but they wouldn't do it to help the Palestinians. You understand? I hope you understand the logic. They do it to further divide people and pit them against each other so that they could divide and rule the population. So how does this relate to racism, to ethnic conflict, to religious conflict, to these questions? Well, we don't just come at it with this like liberal approach. We don't just say racism's bad. Like, yeah, we know. Like, a lot of people know that. Everyone knows this. Like, racism, it is bad, yes. But no, we're revolutionary Marxists. We describe, look, the working class does not have an interest in like one sector of the working class, we stand by this, does not have an interest in oppressing the other side. I know sometimes you hear this idea in some academic circles. No, white workers have an interest in oppressing indigenous workers or black workers or whatever. I think that's a very pernicious idea. And actually, this happens to be the argument of racists on the other side, where they argue, well, no, we have an interest. Like Netanyahu more or less argues this. We have an interest in oppressing and subduing these people. That's the opinion of the far right in Israel, right? So we can't fall into that. We can't fall into the clash of cultures and the clash of religions and the clash of races. Jews and Arabs, Jews and Muslims lived in Palestine as happy neighbors for a long, long time. They're not genetically predisposed to hating each other. This is a monster that has been created by imperialism. So we say, workers of the world unite. No working class person has an interest in oppressing any working class person. It's like this. I don't know if you've heard this example, or you may have seen this meme. It's like there's like 10 cookies, and there's a CEO, and there's a white worker, and then there's an immigrant worker, and the CEO takes 9.5 cookies. And then he looks at the white worker and he says, watch out, that guy's going to take your half cookie. This is essentially what's happening. Now, some people may say, see, the white worker is benefiting because he's taking the whole half cookie. We say, this is ridiculous. We want all of it, and we want the working class deserves all of it, and then we can live. We believe that's ultimately what socialism is all about, right? We don't believe that any sector of the working class has an innate interest in oppressing the other. So yeah, we say workers of the world unite. We fight against racism, against any form of oppression, but we fight against it on a class point of view, from a class point of view. Why? So there's been some historical questions that I want to address here. I think, was it Yasmin? Yes, about the Gulf Muslim countries. So the history of the Palestinian liberation struggle was, first, it was like there were wars of like Arab countries against Israel first, right? And then what happened is relations started to become normalized, and a lot of the different Arab countries, they moved away. And actually, a lot of the Arab countries, if you understand, I talked about the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the dividing up of the region. Most of these Arab regimes, like in Saudi Arabia or in the Gulf region, they were completely artificial. It was basically the imperialism uniting with some of the most reactionary bastards in the region to form a government and hold down the people, right? So I don't believe they actually have a real interest in aiding the Palestinians, which is, you can patently see it now, especially with Egypt. You see this, they closed the border, they don't want any of it, right? But all the other Arab nations, what are they doing? What are they saying? They're clamping down on protests in their own country. Why? So is this about race or religion? If it was, wouldn't they be aiding? No, it's about class. Ultimately, I think it's very clearly about class. The Palestinian liberation struggle, also about class. There's been different perspectives in the movement. You've had the PLO, that was a kind of a secular, semi-socialist organization, actually, that fought, but ultimately did not take a socialist point of view, did not take a communist point of view, wasn't fighting to unite the working class and overthrow capitalism and imperialism. They more or less were accepting capitalism, more or less. So what ended up happening? They betrayed, ultimately. And now you have PLO leaders in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority, that are millionaires, the Abbas family. They're millionaires, and that's why they're doing this. It's a question of class. Inviting Joe Biden. What you find about in oppressed groups, you have the upper layers, the rich layers. They'll give lip service to the struggle against oppression and for liberation. But then when push comes to shove, they always jump ship on the other side. We've seen this a bit. Sorry, I didn't get your name at the back about from the U.S., right? Yeah, with the question of like the black struggle in the U.S., we've seen this in the civil rights movement. A bunch of the leaders ended up basically betraying the struggle, becoming like senators, and then denouncing Black Lives Matter that happened in the last few years. Is wild. Like it's almost, and you get this even with black celebrities. Like the richer they get, all of a sudden they change sides. You know what I mean? So I believe that we got to have a class point of view here, right? We don't have faith in the ruling class of any of these countries. Historically, one of the best examples of this was, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Black September, 1970. A large part of the Palestinian population was pushed into Jordan after the 1967 war. And the PLO and the PLFP had a strategy that was, it was more or less like Arab nationalists or something like that, right? What happened? I don't have time to go through the whole history. They were slaughtered by the Jordanian monarchy. Because actually, I think that they could have probably overthrown the Jordanian monarchy, right? And maybe established a socialist republic in the West Bank and Jordan, I don't know, and then carried out a revolutionary war against Israel, against Israeli imperialism or something. But I think, yeah, we got to fight on a class basis. We can't have faith in any ruling class or anything like that in order to fight against all forms of oppression and fight for the liberation of all oppressed peoples. I'm just ranting about the Marxist approach to fight racism and the class question. And I guess this kind of gets back onto the settler thing. I guess, yeah, Zionism is powerful because Jewish people were very oppressed, and the Zionists use this argument so that everyone's against them. Now, if we fall into that argument and say, yes, you're all settlers, everyone should be expelled, you just basically hand the Zionists the biggest fucking weapon that they could possibly have. So we got to be very careful about that. Now, there's a settler movement in the West Bank, which is completely reactionary, that we entirely oppose. And these people, I think, should be ejected. The land should be re-given, you know. But also, this question, look, I believe on a capitalist basis, like I said, it's very difficult to solve people fighting over land. I think if you have a workers' government, workers come to power, this could be addressed. Everyone needs a place to live. There's the questions of national sovereignty and whatnot. I think this could be addressed. But now, under capitalism, I think that's not on the cards right now. I think what we need to fight for, we need to fight against, like I said, imperialism in our own country, fight against imperialism, Canadian imperialism in our own country, and yeah, support the Palestinian resistance, raise awareness here in Canada, and fight for a revolutionary communist perspective for the struggle in the long run. Basically, everything needs to be connected to that, because if we fall into this like war of peoples, I think you just help the Zionists ultimately. So yeah, that's why we fight against racism, we fight against Zionism, ultimately on a class point of view, right? I think that's very important. On the question about productive resistance, burning shit down. Yeah, I did notice that in 2020. As soon as black people started burning shit down, all the politicians were like, "Oh shit, we got to do something." They claimed to defund police services. They of course did not. They waited. They said that the movement died down, and then they actually increased funding, which actually tells us something about the capitalist state. There's bullshit. It's absolute bullshit. But yeah, we believe in a revolution. Revolution can be messy, and it often is. We prefer it not to be. To be honest, we prefer it to be organized. We prefer it to be peaceful. Burning things down, I'd prefer seizing them, to be honest. It'd be nice to take over the factories, the mines, have working class people take over buildings, you know, whatnot, capitalist enterprises. We can start running them ourselves. That's the approach that we would take. However, when you have a situation like in 2020, in America or in Israel, Palestine for that matter, with poor oppressed people held down, subjected to racism, horrible oppression, do you really fault people for burning shit down? No, it's totally understandable. So I hope that's clear. But what's our approach? Now, we believe it's easy it's easy to know what you're against. Everyone knows what we're against, right? It's very clear. I think amongst a lot of people, we all know what we're opposed to. It's not so easy to figure out what you're in favor of, right? And this is a question. I believe revolution's inevitable. I think capitalism creates revolution. I think it creates the conditions for revolution. The spark is always something a bit random, you know? Like George Floyd wasn't the first black guy to be killed by the cops, but that happened to be the moment that exploded the whole thing in the U.S. a few years ago. So I believe revolutions are inevitable. Capitalism creates the conditions for revolutions, but revolution doesn't inevitably win on its own. And actually, I mentioned the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring is a good example of this. What happened? In a lot of Arab countries where they overthrew the government, like in Egypt, for example, it's worse. It's worse, actually. People are like, this is horrible. And there's a lot of depression in the movement. I think it's eventually going to come back, and I think that many people have learned some hard lessons, right? So people went into the revolution in Egypt, and they overthrow the military dictatorship. They eventually overthrew the Muslim Brotherhood. And then what do they get? Military dictatorship again. What did we say? We said we got the communists in Egypt, in Canada, in Palestine, even in Israel, need to organize themselves and need to fight for a communist perspective. Otherwise, you have a revolution, and what happens? Another crappy rich person steps into power. Another military dictatorship is established. Another racist regime is established. So I think we as working class people, we need to figure out what we want. That's why we're communists. We believe it is possible to have another form of society, not dominated by a small group of very, very rich people that control everything, not based on the so-called free markets, based on the democratic control and planning of the resources of humanity for the betterment of all of humanity in harmony with the environment. So that's ultimately what we believe. And I think, we need to fight for that. It's not something that's just going to happen randomly, right? I think if you just leave it, then Marx famously said the choice is socialism or barbarism. And every year, there's more and more examples of barbarism, whether it's climate barbarism, whether it's the situation in the Middle East, whether it's increased racism, whether it's increased attacks on trans people, you name it, it's happening again and again everywhere. So we need to fight for a bold, optimistic communist future opposed to the barbaric doom and gloom of the future of capitalism. I'll leave it at that.